Zach. We've known each other for a little while now, and I'm very interested in how you came to this intersection between human medicine and agriculture.
Yeah, it was not a linear trajectory for sure, and I think that's how most of us find our way towards our purpose in life is long and winding paths. And mine took me from drug development, where I was doing chemotherapy development in the context of my specialty, which is endocrinology and metabolism, which clinically, I'm seeing a lot of diabetes and a lot of metabolic disorders at that time. And so clinically, I was seeing the consequences of a lot of lifestyle, shift that had happened in the population. Simultaneous under the microscope, studying cancer, developing drugs around, what is it to kill a cancer cell, found myself in the context of vitamin A molecules. And vitamin A turns out to be a very potent mechanism by which you can help a cancer cell realize that it's cancerous and not connected to its original identity, and it will kill itself at that point, which is nifty because then you don't need the immune system to find it or anything else. The cancer simply commits suicide. So it was an exciting era. This was kind of 2005 to 2010 kind of time frame where felt like I was really forging into this uncharted territory of getting cancer cells to be aware of their own problem. And it was a couple of years into that I kind of finally connected the dots that vitamin A is from carrots, or from a food source, And so my education was so poor in the area of nutrition that, that was a huge leap for me to get even to that basic point. Over the next couple of years of research and clinical care, I came to this kind of crossroads where the cancer was intersecting with diabetes, for example, and starting to realize that all of these disease processes were actually, in the end, just one thing. It was a disconnect of communication and the resulting inflammation that comes from that lack of communication at the cell level. And at that point, my whole 17 years in academic medicine started to fall apart because I had really been trained that there's 10,000 diseases, and for every disease there's 4 or 5 drugs you need to memorize, and they do these different complex pathways. To boil that down to one problem was, on one level a bit depressing, and on another level just was goosebump exciting of we don't have to pour billions and trillions of dollars into medical research to figure out health if it all stems from one source. We don't need to figure out trillions of dollars of disease management if it all stems from one source. And so that's how I found myself ultimately to the topic of the dinner plate and how we were going to hit that ground zero. And so I left academia in 2010, pretty desperate in that shift, and didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to run a company or anything like that, but started a little nutrition center out in the rural Virginia area. And so it was a town of 540 people, one of the poorest communities in the state. And in that journey, started to really connect with this message of we need to start growing our own food. Mostly because my patients were so poor that they couldn't afford to go to Whole Foods. That was 60 miles away anyways, and they weren't going to be able to make that leap towards health food being provided for them. They were going to have to tie back into their own growth. And so that was my segue into the beginning of thinking about the garden, at least, as the first step. And then after a couple of years of that, amazingly found that my patients were getting sicker often on health food, not better. And I couldn't figure that out for quite some time until we started to really analyze the nutrients that are in kale, for example, today versus the nutrients of 40 years ago. All of this, the nutrition science I was practicing in my clinic was based on research that had come out of the 1960s and 70s, where some phenomenal work was being done by Columbia University and a lot of other groups to prove that nutrition could change the course of risk of and prevention of and treatment of disease. And so I was applying those old tools without the same effects, it seemed. And so that started me down this journey into thinking about if there's stuff missing in the food, and that stuff must have come from the soil, what's in the soil? And that was my journey into meeting you, ultimately, a carbon cowboy out there, really starting to define what it is to be closing the loop on a regenerative process of soil that would then produce the food that would then produce health in the animal or the human.
So you said something very interesting to me. You said that in all of your medical training, that you really didn't acquire the nutritional knowledge that you feel like a medical doctor needs. So a couple of questions around that. First, is that common in medical schools today that students do not receive adequate nutritional training?
Not only do we not receive adequate, we don't receive any, really, is the reality. There's one course called nutrition that most medical schools will provide in the first semester of medical school. And that's for same first semester, you learn physiology. There's a course called physiology. And that's trying to teach you what normal cell function looks like. Nutrition, as a course would be great if, in fact, it was about nutrition. But really, it's about, here's the food pyramid. Here's 60-year-old data from the special interest in the food industry, and this is what we think looks like some sort of balanced diet. But no information in there as to what happens to a nutrient when it enters the complex ecosystem of a human gut and then gets transformed into not just macronutrients, but micronutrients. And even more bizarre now, of course, in this world of new medicine is these tiny little carbon molecules that are present in the soil or in your gut that do cell-cell communication. And so I was never taught anything, approaching that. And I travel now extensively and teach doctors all over the world. None of them have heard of this data. I mean, this is all, new experience for that medical mind that, in fact, the microbiome, the bacteria, the fungi of the soil is what would produce the medicine and the food, and then its transaction with the microbiome in our gut, the soil therein, would then produce the bioavailability of those nutrients and medicines in our gut, in our bloodstream, ultimately for the cell, coordinating this extraordinary thing that we do every day naturally in a good environment, which is healing. And there's not a single course in medical school called healing. We don't even know what the healing process looks like at the cellular level. And so that's been my journey in the last few years of running my own basic science laboratory where we study mechanisms of healing. It's extraordinary. It's in the quantum physics realm of speed, efficiency, genius. I mean, we are clearly built of the fabric of life, and it has a drive for life. And so whether it's a piece of soil that's been damaged or a human body that's been damaged, the pace of healing is always 10x that of the injury.
So what you're telling me, and this is really very important, what you're telling me is that the average doctor in the U.S. today is really completely divorced from the concept that food is a part of a healthy life and a part of healing.
Yeah, and not only are we divorced from that, I think we're not even taught which tools to reach for. Knowing our weakness, you would think, you're weak here, and so we send people to dietitians. But those dietitians are 9 times out of 10 trained around that food pyramid kind of concept, which again has no science behind it. The food pyramid was created by the special interests of the dairy industry, the meat industry, the commodities market of vegetable and fruit growing. And so these special interests all said, well, we need to be represented here. And it was built around a misunderstanding of disease processes to begin with. We thought cholesterol caused heart disease. Well, it doesn't in the end. In fact, cholesterol is very critical in preventing heart disease. And so, we had this, flawed disease model that we were trying to stick nutrition into. Another example, other than heart disease, is bone health. All these decades of endocrinology, we've been telling women to drink more milk for bone health because the bone is made out of these complex calcium substrates and there's some calcium in milk. We just assumed that if you put calcium in your gut, it must end up in the bone. Turns out that's not at all the case. You're more likely to calcify inflamed areas of your blood vessels and everything else. And in fact, a lot of studies are now suggesting that you may be depleting your bone mineral calcium by taking oral calcium. So we've had these mistaken belief systems about the disease. We tried to cram in a non-scientific approach to nutrition into that. And so it's broken on so many levels that to this day, 10 years into the journey of learning nutrition, under the microscope all the way to my patients, I still feel like I have no grasp on really saying, this is ideal nutrition or this is exactly what you should eat, because the system is too complex.
Yeah. So if we continue along this thread a little bit, in the 1930s, there was a classic research trial conducted by a group of pediatricians with children at an orphanage here in the U.S. And Dr. Fred Provenza writes about this trial in his book, Nourishment. But in that trial, these children were started on a diet at the age of 6 months, and they tracked them all the way through 6 years of age. And interestingly enough, each child, each meal of the day was given an array, basically a buffet of items that they could select from that contain 4 fruits, 10 vegetables, 7 different meats, bone marrow, by the way, sea salt, and 4 different drinks. And back in the 1930s, we know those drinks weren't Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper and Sprite and Red Bull.
That's right.
It had to be, or what it was milk, it was water, and 2 fruit juices. And of course, another thing I'm going to contend is that all of these items in the 1930s would have inherently been much more nutrient dense than any of those items today. In that trial, they found that no 2 children ever selected the same foods for the same, for subsequent meals, or even in the same day or subsequent days. And that each child always was quite varied in what they selected from day to day among that array or that buffet of what they had to select from. And tracking them through, Dr. Joseph Brenneman, one of the attending pediatricians, stated that this was the healthiest group of children he has ever seen, both physically and mentally. And keep in mind, these were all children in an orphanage, right? Not children from stable 2-parent homes. So in your mind, since you're a medical doctor, how did we get so far removed from that? That trial, I guess in my mind, that trial should be taught in every medical school.
For sure.
Did you ever hear about that when you were a medical student?
Not even remotely. No, I think that, we really begin our understanding of nutrition as medical doctors around the 1960s and 70s when we started doing large population studies that were largely done around starvation, right? And so we were never really, as medical doctors, we're never given the opportunity to ask the question, how do you create optimal health? We're always asking the question, how do you stem disease? How do you reverse disease or manage disease or whatever it is? And so for that reason, we're never brought into that environment where we're even asking perhaps those right questions of how does a child get nurtured by a food environment that creates optimal brain function, optimal health? That's not being asked, at a university level across the board. And so I think that study is very indicative of something around our new understanding of what is nutrition, which is microbiome. You're really feeding not your human when you sit down at the dinner table, you're feeding the bacteria and the fungi. And when the bacteria and fungi have access to a wide nutrient panel, they actually dictate what you go and eat. That child's brain never made the decision, oh, I want this, or I want that, or I want this, because in the 1930s, none of those foods had been yet converted to a drug. Yes. And that's how we got away from 17 different options on that, is we started to turn our food into drugs by the 1960s. Right. And what we did was, through food chemistry, right, which is 2 words that should never be put together, but through food chemistry, where we started to manipulate the molecules within the food, creating things like high fructose corn syrup and the things that became dominant in the processed food environment, we started to realize that we could change human behavior with those things. And if we put a combination of high fructose corn syrup, fat and sugar, or fat and salt in the same bite of food, then suddenly the amount of caloric intake shot up. And so we could get a Happy Meal to serve, to sell 10 times better with the right combination of fat, salt, sugar, in there. And when you look at a PET scan of the brain showing kind of the functional experience or reaction of a brain in real time, you can see that it's exactly the same pattern in that fat, salt, sugar combination that you would see in a cocaine hit. And so that's when we changed nutrition, is when we started to realize that we could put these basic substrates of fat, sugar, salt combinations and create a demand at the brain level that had nothing to do with nutrients, and ultimately nothing to do with calories either. But I think what those children were doing in the 1930s is they were literally eating for nutrient density and nutrient diversity, and now a child today simply eats for the rush of the cocaine.
That's an incredibly profound statement, but also at the same time hugely concerning. And I know that you as a medical doctor had seen that manifested in the patients that you've had through the years. So let me ask you this. We find ourselves in this current situation, both from a medical standpoint, a human health standpoint, and what we're seeing in agriculture. So based on what you now know and your experiences, how do we tie in the way we produce our foods, whether it's crops, vegetables, fruits, or proteins? How should farmers and ranchers be approaching the way they produce those foods to be able to positively impact human health as well as ecosystem health?
Very good. And before I attempt to answer that, maybe just underline the urgency of that shift. 46% of children in the United States are now diagnosed with a chronic disorder or disease by the time they're 18. 46%. We're hitting 1 in 2 children with a chronic disorder or disease. And those are led by environmental intolerances, right? And so it's seasonal or severe environmental and food allergies, asthma, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, where the child can't do sensory processing, gets overwhelmed easily by even simple stimulation, autism now hitting 1 in 30 kids. You go into the anxiety disorders by the late kind of single digits, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, major depression by 12, 13, 14, sleep disorders happening by 15, 16, chronic fatigue, chronic pain syndromes happening in those mid-teens. You've got the autoimmune diseases that kick in during puberty. 1 in 4 girls now in the United States with antibodies to her thyroid gland by the time they're 12. These are just, stunning little studies that have been kind of cracking the blinders that we've had on into just how stressed our children are today. All of that is to speak to this critical moment where we have to stop looking to the doctors for the solution, because we aren't the solution. We are doing patch jobs, we're throwing Band-Aids on all of this disease that's coming down the pike. We don't have a healthcare system that can deliver adequate care to 46% of the population of children. And so now if we fast forward 10 years, imagine what that 46% of those sick kids are going to look like when they hit 40. That's going to be a disaster. And so we don't have a healthcare system that can handle that. And so it's going to come down to the prevention side of this equation, which is absolutely going to be the farmer, not the physician. And so the farmers that I now get to work with, including your group, just give me so much hope, because A, you guys already see the writings on the wall for conventional farming. It does not work. It's just as broken as the healthcare system. There's economic urgency for the farmer to change the modalities. So that's fantastic, And further than that, the ingenuity and the common sense foundation that farmers have give me much more hope than kind of the situation we have in the physician community, where I feel like we are so far down the rabbit hole of minutia that common sense has been largely beat the crap out of us. And so I see on these farms just the sensible thing of like, there's soil, there's fungi in my soil, there's the mycorrhizae, there's the mycelium, there's the bacteria, here's compost, basic, obvious, common sense stuff. And you walk into a doctor's office, even in kind of the more kind of integrative medicine that I'm now in, for a moment you get this lip service to, yeah, we're very holistic, We're very open. But then you look at what's being applied, and it's some new technology or new, this or that, and they just went to this lecture and they heard about this thing, and they're right back down that same rabbit hole because they've been so divorced and maybe even haven't even been shown yet what are those fundamentals of human health. And so that's why I get excited about our work that we're doing in the lab now is we just figured out compost, and that's it so far. But my gosh, what a leap forward to figure out what human compost looks like. What does the human gut need to compost that organic soil? And that's the very first crack in that iceberg that we now need to go solve. And I think nutrition science is going to radically change, and it's going to happen because all of the science now being poured in the microbiome. And as we come to figure out what bacteria and fungi are really calling for, we're going to start to really be able to quickly, I think, reintegrate the human experience into that natural state that you described in those children in the 1930s, which is the microbiome wants diversity in its own ecosystem, as well as the nutrients that would feed that ecosystem. And we know that those bacteria are very good at manipulating our behavior. And so if you've gone and trained your gut into eating fat, salt, sugar combinations, you've now refined your gut microbiome into this very narrow spectrum of bugs that are forcing you to eat more of that because that's what they eat. Yeah. And so when you have an antibiotic exposure and you collapse some 80% of your biodiversity in 2 weeks of antibiotics, you just lost the intelligence of that balanced ecosystem, and now you just have a few weed-like organisms that are calling for what they want, which is likely to be some of the more noxious stuff out there because they are the weeds. That's what weeds do. Weeds are very good at dealing with detoxification and getting junk processed out of your body that shouldn't be there. Well, if your dominant species process junk, no problem eating more junk. And it's very likely that they'll keep sending signal of like, yep, I can deal with that, I can deal with that. And they're not encouraging you to shift that nutritional course. And we see this in even bizarre cases of like transplants, liver transplant or kidney transplant, and the recipient can wake up on the table with different food preference. You changed a solid organ and they wake up with a different food preference. Yeah. How is that possible? Well, we now are finding out that every organ in our body is full of bacteria of some sort or another, or is working in concert with different species of bacteria.
Which creates a memory, right?
And there's a memory to that, yeah. And so suddenly the woman wakes up on the operating table or in the recovery unit, and she's craving chicken nuggets for no reason, except that the guy who just donated that kidney, who died last week, was hit on his way to McDonald's to get his chicken nuggets. And that has been well documented in multiple cases now, that food preference is memorized by that internal organ and its relationship to the microbiome that would be providing nutrients for that organ. And so it's just this bizarre realization of, wow, when we go and screw with the ecosystem through, I think really antibiotics are ground zero of our health epidemic. And not just antibiotics from the doctors, antibiotics in our food production system, all the way down to our soil treatment with glyphosate and Roundup, which acts as an antibiotic. We start screwing with that biodiversity, we have no idea what we're doing to the water structure, the memory, the intelligence of the organ systems such that they're now ungrounded. They don't remember what health feels like or what would have gotten them to health. The kidney can't remember what it would take it to kidney health. And so it just starts doing damage control, and it's now living in a moment-to-moment fight or flight state. The whole organism now in a fight or flight state, and you see the human behavior towards its food that we have today, which is, as you mentioned, the Red Bulls, the caffeine stimulus, the Starbucks phenomenon. We literally have coffees now that are 850 calories. It's like that was a whole meal back in the day, and now you get that in your little 16-ounce cup. And not to mention there's all the microplastics and everything else and weirdness. Like the situation we've created in such a short period of time is staggering in its errors, but encouraging that it is such a short period of time. Yeah. We don't have to go back to some paleo era man to figure out what they were eating. We just need to figure out what the kids in the 1930s were eating, not too far back.
Well, I can imagine those kids today. So those kids in the 1930s were provided this incredible, bountiful buffet every day, right? multiple fruits, vegetables, meats, whole grains, all of this. But I would imagine that the vast majority of kids today, that if we laid out that same buffet with those same items, would look at that table and say, where's the pizza and the Doritos?
No question, because again, it's partly the kid's behavior, but it's more the kid's drug effect is not seeing anything that's going to stimulate dopamine on that table. And so the brain of that child has never experienced, literally, because it's been 3 generations now since we could experience it, that kid has no way of knowing, the brain of that child has no way of knowing that the tomato that was just grown in that regenerative soil has lycopene in there. And when you experience lycopene coming into the intestinal environment, you get this huge anti-inflammatory effect and a huge kind of burst of kind of new information across the immune system and everything else. The kid doesn't know that. At the biologic level, there's no memory of that. There's no, experience therein. And so this is why when we're teaching, adults are more difficult to shift than children, but teaching an adult or a child how to eat again, you have to remind them that you need to expose your body repeatedly to a Brussels sprout or a kale or a tomato, and reteach not just your taste buds, but your immune system, the enzyme pathways that would get that bioavailable medicine of the alkaloids out of that tomato or whatever it is. You have to do that multiple times. Yeah. And so our rough estimate is somewhere in that 7 to 14 times of consumption. Your body now learns that pathway, memorizes that, and says, okay, today I wake up and I have some inflammation in my back because I overdid it yesterday, or I didn't sleep enough, and so I need some stimulation of dopamine here. To do that, I need not a drug, I need something with phenylalanine and tyrosine and these important amino acids, and I'm going to take that from that food because I remember when I ate that food, I got that in the brain a couple hours later. And so the organism is super intelligent, just like those children demonstrated in the 1930s, of knowing what it needed at that moment. And there is no 2 moments alike. Your body is always ready for something different and in need of something different than the moment before. And so I'm very excited by this farm to table movement that we have. We're starting to see fruits and vegetables show up on grocery store shelves that haven't been there in decades. The daikon radish may be a good example of this. That giant thing looks like a giant white carrot, and people walk by that thing all the time in the grocery store, and brain doesn't even register that it's there because it has no idea what that thing is. That looks confusing and large and a pain in the neck to chop up. When in reality, there's critical nutrients from many of these root vegetables that have been devoid, but it's showing up, and people are starting to talk about it, and morning talk shows are starting to talk about arugula, and all of this stuff is starting to filter back into the day-to-day experience of the consumer, which means that we're starting to crack that black box that has been nutrition through just exposure. We just need to be exposed, like that child who stares at that table of the 1930s and says, I have no idea what's going on there. Exposure, exposure, exposure. And in a very short period of time, that if that kid was put in that environment every day and given no other choices, within a month, they would be the healthiest they've ever been, period. And I've seen that happen again and again. If I change the nutritional environment, I can take people who have been suffering decades, 4, 7, 8 decades of decline, and within 3 months, they're experiencing physiologic function in their body that they literally didn't experience 20 years ago. And so that's the speed and the capacity of the human biology is to say, let's go beyond this degenerative state and go into a regenerative biology. If it happens in the soil, it's going to happen in the plant, it's going to happen in the human, and we're going to see life emerge from this decaying, kind of destructive, consumptive health/disease environment we're currently in.
So you have a lot of formal training in endocrinology, and I have a lot of formal training in physiology. So when you understand physiology of the body, you understand that there's negative feedback systems, positive feedback systems. And now in agriculture, we're coming to understand in terms of ecology and the ecosystem that just like all of the parts of the body act as a single organism to produce either positive or negative feedback, we're finding that the microbes in the soil, the plants, and the herbivores that eat those plants also tend to act as a single organism, and we have both negative and positive feedback there. So from your experience, can you speak to what you see as being the key negative and positive feedbacks in agriculture to be able to produce these astoundingly good foods that we now need and must have to restore the health of our population?
Yeah, I mean, you're really hitting on so many important things there. The description you just had, the herbivore hoof, the soil, the microbiome therein, the nutrients, the plant itself, all being in this communication network, I think really is a very important understanding that needs to get to the consumer now, is that you can't have a healthy carrot without the healthy soil, without the microbiome creating that soil, without the hoof and the stool of the animal, the cow patty and the urine, or, historically the bison. Mm-hmm. These pieces were developed over millions and millions and millions of years together. And nothing could happen in a vacuum. A carrot couldn't develop into its nutrient profile without the whole mix of that ecosystem interacting. And I really believe, while it's going to take us probably a little bit more time, maybe in the next few years, we're really close now, I think, in understanding and proving this out. But we can now start to understand that the genomic information that's responding to the moment by moment, we call them, these little things are called microRNA. And so the microRNA are little tiny segments of information that are produced by our non-gene coding DNA. So that's 98% of our genome. And 98% of the DNA in your body is making these tiny little signaling guys. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about microRNA is it leaves the cell, whereas DNA and messenger RNA and the proteins that they make are typically very much isolated within the cell or its immediate environment. MicroRNA are so tiny they travel not just into the bloodstream and away from that localized cell that might be a liver cell trying to communicate upstream to the gut lining or something like that. We now know that 30 to 40% of the microRNA in the bloodstream is not from human source at all, but actually from the DNA that produced the microRNA in the food you just ate and from the bacteria and fungi that are now consuming that food. And so in other words, even in its nascent state, we realize 40%. In another couple of years, as this science continues to emerge, we're going to find out that 98.5 or 99.99% of the microRNA in our bloodstream is non-human. We just haven't been able to catalog all of it yet. But because of the size of the microbiome, because of the size of the genomic capacity of the microbiome, which is in many hundreds of trillions of genes versus the 20,000 genes humans have. Right. And so that huge genomic information is changing the behavior of the human at the genetic level. You're literally being told to build a different body by the microbiome. And we know this now by showing that if we take the stool of an obese patient and put it in a mouse, control that mouse's diet so it cannot change its food consumption, that mouse will be obese in a month.
Really?
That's what microRNA is capable of. It will change the genetics of that mouse to match the obesity of the human that was just there by its microRNA messaging. Not surprisingly, the microRNA environment that is producing the obesity is one of stress. Yes. You put an organism under stress, it's going to start storing fat. Yeah. And we literally do this to cattle every day in our CAFOs intentionally. We stress them so that they inject fat into their muscles and we get marbled meat. And so one of the long-time practices in feedlots that I now work in are these beta agonists. These are drugs that stimulate the adrenaline pathways in the body, and we put cows on adrenaline kind of beta agonists for the last 4 weeks of their life to inject their muscle with all of this fat. And so when we stress an organism, its reaction is typically, I better store energy. And that fat storage is critical. And so that microRNA stress environment now, you start to picture, well, what if it's a stressed piece of soil? If the soil is stressed through chemical farming, over-tilling is a disaster, you guys have taught me that so well, that over-tilling, the destruction of the mycorrhizae, now the whole, whatever's left in the genomic information of the soil is screaming, help, panic, don't put in nutrients for muscle and kind of anabolic growth, put it into stress storage and all that. Now imagine the carrot that's going to grow in that.
Yes.
Or imagine the corn that's going to grow in that stressed soil, receiving all the stress message of the soil. The corn now in a stressed state actually is going to grow vertically faster and produce more fruit with less nutrient density and everything else. But it's in a panic mode. It's going to start throwing out progeny because it's stressed. And the very message to the progeny is, it's a famine, there's no nutrients for us, do your best, hopefully, keep reproducing so that hopefully we get past this famine and maybe a future generation will have plenty of nutrients. Well, it's been so many generations of corn now without any nutrients, without any relief, that their genetics, the genetics of the corn that we consume, is so repeatedly stressed out. We put that into a cow that, yes, is torn away from its family unit, put into a CAFO, feedlot, pretty intense, put into a CAFO feedlot, pretty intense kind of stress environment for the cow just in that setting, and then you feed it a bunch of corn that is generationally stressed out. All the microRNA going into that cow now is saying, it's hopeless, there's no nutrients, store fat, don't worry about producing healthy muscle, just try to survive.
Yeah.
That hamburger then ends up on somebody's plate who just dropped the kids off at school. Kids are struggling in school because one of the kids has asthma, another one has attention deficit disorder, stressed out mother, finances are in the hole, shows up at lunch, and the whole message of that meal is hopelessness, stress, famine, everything else, and they produce that again in their body. And so we understand it from that up, from bottom up, that stress is being propagated up to the consumer. But like the triangle you drew, I think that a stressed out carrot sends a stressed out signal back down to the soil.
Yes.
And back up to the animal that's grazing on that land and everything else. And so we will eventually find out that everything is connected. The messaging of stress and depletion is system-wide.
Well, the one thing that we know now on our own farms and on the farms of many of our clients that we work with is that if we build truly healthy soil, microbially rich soil that is free of the stress that you're talking about, then those plants and those animals that are connected to that soil are far healthier themselves. We don't need the antibiotics, all the other pharmaceuticals and the supplements and everything else that many have come to believe are absolutely necessary in either the row crop or the livestock sectors. They become really, they're a crutch, is what they are. And as we make these improvements in this ecosystem that they exist in, then everything improves rather dramatically. And thus, what we're eating is far more nutrient dense and sends the same signals to our bodies. Those no stress signals, right? Rather than high stress signals.
So what you're describing there is resilience, right?
Yes.
You get to this point where the organism, whether it's the plant or the cow or the human, becomes resilient in their ability to heal, repair, and they become autonomous and independent again. And that's, I think, where you and I now are in lockstep of our kind of mindset or philosophy of management, whether it's a farm management or a patient management. We're now realizing that the less inputs you use, the more brilliant the system becomes, and it's
Yes.
Manifesting this intrinsic health. There is the knowledge and capacity and wisdom for health in a plant, in the soil itself, in the microbiome, in the human, that we somehow lost track of. We gave up on the belief that our bodies can heal themselves, and we started looking to the doctor for the quick fix. We gave up on the belief that soil can create its own nutrient density, and we started looking to the pharmaceuticals for the quick fix. And so the resilience you talk about is so funny, because you would think that faced with 46% of children with disease and some 70% of adults by 2030 likely to have cancer, we're facing this huge dilemma, and you would think we need so much knowledge and so much technology and so much, no. We actually need to just shut up for a moment, just pause as human doers and try not to fix anything for a moment and just watch what was the original format of this before we showed up, because we're kind of recent on the scene, whether it's 5,000 years or 180,000 years, depending on your belief system. That's a few thousand years in the context of millions of years of development of these complex systems around us. We're new on the scene, and especially as micromanagers of these systems, we're brand new on the scene. And so just in the last 30, 40 years, we've started to manipulate human biology, cow biology, soil biology on the level that we do today, down to the level of obviously genetic modification, right? We're genetically modifying our corn, our soybean, alfalfa, canola, the salmon now. We're screwing with life in terrifying ways, and yet we're still only picking away at it. And nature immediately adapts, right? And we've seen that in the weeds now. You use Roundup for a couple years, and now you have Roundup-resistant weeds. Their genetics shift immediately to that new genetic screw-up that we created. And it says, no, that's not good. We're going to get around that. We're going to get this thing figured out. So nature is extraordinarily intelligent. It has cycles and feedback loops of communication, and we need to start to observe those, trust those, and ultimately participate in those. And that's what I think soil management or good doctoring is going to look like, is a cooperative relationship to those feedback loops and finding the feedback loops that are broken and disrupted, and perhaps putting in solutions there that are nature's natural systems or corrections for those. And you're doing that obviously with the hoof of animals. Yeah. You got this dead soil, the missing piece was the hoof, you're closing the loop, the carbon cycle completes, we can reverse global warming, we can reverse the poisoning of our oceans, we can do all of that by letting the soil and the animal and the human back into the same loop.
So basically what we're saying here is that in spite of these monumental problems that we're facing with human health, with agriculture, and with ecosystem health, there's real hope that if we just simply, as you said, back off and let nature be nature, and let this system reinvigorate, reestablish, and rejuvenate itself, that we have the wherewithal, we actually do have the means to be able to restore health to each of these systems and health to our own bodies.
It's perfect. The hope is so real. The nagging part that keeps me driving as hard as I do is around the question of, is it soon enough, to stem a huge loss of life? Because we are going to see a huge contraction of our population just by our infertility alone. But I think we're going to see an unfortunate, very untimely death to many, many children and in these next generations. And so the hope is that humanity will survive and learn to play cooperatively with nature again, perhaps in ways that we never have. I don't know that we've ever cooperatively been in play with nature in Western civilization, at least. If you look at native peoples, they were in relationship to it. And when Western civilization got created and we came and wiped out all of the native populations and their wisdom and their understanding of these cycles, we lost out. Fortunately, these native populations are coming back into communication, and I really take great hope in the Native American groups now that are starting to work together, 400 tribes, starting to communicate again, pass wisdom back and forth. That's going to be the level that I think is going to be necessary. We can't just, fix carrots. We need to fix human behavior on that grand scale, and ultimately it's about communication. And if we learn how to communicate once again, to cooperatively be observant of the systems we're born within, and then have the respect towards one another that would allow for that cooperative wisdom to emerge, then we could stem the real collapse that is almost inevitable at this moment. So I do have hope. It wanes a little bit each day on some levels, and embers start getting hotter and growing brighter also. And certainly The farm community is right now where my greatest hope lies. I continue to speak extensively to the physician community. I can tell you the physicians aren't changing fast enough to be a part of the real urgent solution. The farmers seem to be ready to go fast enough and furious enough and transform enough acres to make this happen. So as consumers out there, I'm really eager for everybody to tap into you guys and your process. And so our nonprofit that we've now got this outreach with Farmers Footprint, our film series, we're making this cry for help to the consumer to say, we're going to show you the science of what connects your child's health to the nutrition on the plate. And these guys are going to come along and create that nutrient-dense food that your children are needing to complete their loops of healing and natural, regenerative, and robust nature of health in them. And I think that message of health is resonating at every level, through all of the levels of consumer and farmer. I think it's been our missing piece is that understanding of how does soil health actually impact the human biology. And we're at this beautiful crossroads now at the science level where we can all finally answer those questions definitively.
Excellent. Zach, thank you. I really appreciate you spending this time with us. This has been incredibly uplifting and informative, and thank you for your advocacy and what you're doing out there to help get this message to people. It's so important.
Well, thank you for what you do. You've been out there for decades pounding this drum, and huge respect for everybody at the Soil Health Academy. But